the noise to bring you the latest facts and news that affect you. Patriot Tonight on SiriusXM Patriot Channel 125.
And welcome back to Patriot Tonight. I'm Carrie Pickett of the Daily Caller. And we have some news on the international front. The Senate passed some sanctions on Russia. The legislation is particularly important because it outlines a number of policy responses to counter Russian influence and contains a number of issues that have to do with, shall we say, how Russia has reacted and acted overseas, particularly issues that have to do with its illegal occupation of Crimea. Also, it has robust sanctions to hold Russia accountable for its actions in dealing with countering Russian propaganda and disinformation. It's also going to be dealing with supporting a defensive lethal military assistance to better enable the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and also it'll be it also links the sanctions to basically help essentially help the Ukraine better deal with the Russian actions against them in the past few years. We didn't see this with the Obama administration, particularly when Russia was so aggressive in how it moved in on Crimea. The Obama administration essentially was a very shall we say weak in this respect. So we have an expert here on the line. We have Dr. Rebecca Grant. She is the president of IRIS, otherwise known as the Independent Research, a public policy research organization in Washington, D.C. She joins us to talk about the sanctions against Russia and Iran that passed the Senate 98-2 earlier today. Welcome to the show, Rebecca.
Glad to be here, Carrie.
So tell me, these particular sanctions against Russia, as well as Iran, how exactly? I was just talking about Crimea specifically, but what are the exact details as far as Crimea is concerned with these particular sanctions?
Well, you're right, Carrie, to go back and look at Russia's takeover of the Crimea part of the Ukraine. That's where the sanctions come from. They were started in 2014. Really, you'd have to get an Excel spreadsheet to look at the number of sanctions that are already piled up on Iran and on Russia, too. But these are some new ones that strengthen our policy against Russia. Where it all started was a response from the U.S. and other countries around the world after Russia annexed the Crimea and took it over and has started a war in Ukraine. So what everyone has said is, hey, Russia, when you agree to a peace framework in Ukraine, then we'll consider lifting sanctions. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel recently told Putin again, hey, sanctions are staying on. The new leadership in France has said the same thing. So we have the U.S. Senate now coming in voting a pretty expected set of sanctions on Iran and Russia. Again, there are sanctions already in place. This ups the ante. And then what's a little bit different here is some specific language where the Senate is trying to make sure that Congress keeps the authority to say what happens in the future with these sanctions.
Dr. Grant, I'm curious here. Why did it take so long for such sanctions to happen? This was an overwhelming bipartisan vote. And this is coming from a Senate full of members that are not exactly getting along these days. Why all of a sudden now and not during the past administration?
You're right. Overwhelming bipartisan vote with just two voting against the two Senate iconoclasts. No surprise, Senator Rand Paul, Senator Bernie Sanders are the two that did not vote for the amendment. But so the question, why now? I think we've seen enough evidence now that Russia really is on a worldwide propaganda campaign. We know they've been targeting the U.S., trying to target lots of individuals and to stir up the press. We see this happening in other countries, too. So that recognition is there now. I think also there's a sense that the Senate wants to be on the record of not bowing down to Russia in any way. They want to make sure that none of them are touched by this so-called Russia cloud that's hanging over the White House. And, they want to be really clear that they disapprove of what we've seen. Now, we don't know a lot of the details still about, what Russia has done and what it hasn't. A lot of it may be a little bit exaggerated, but there's no question the Senate wants to be on record as opposing what they see as any Russian attempts to interfere.
Now, the Iran sanctions. I'm curious as to how this will affect the nuclear deal that the previous administration had with Iran, and how that could shake that up.
Right. Well, we're getting two sets of opinions on this right now as to whether these sanctions are really going to change anything. And let me go back and just say again, we've had some form of sanctions against Iran since about 1979. Really, the list is just absolutely huge. Iran's economy is really contained, and it just in every possible way we've tried to put this pressure on. Now, what we see with the Iran nuclear deal, whether you're in favor of it or not, is a certain process that lays out a pathway for these sanctions to eventually be lifted. We've seen some senators say, in fact, this was the reason that Sanders didn't vote for it. He says, hey, this is really going to limit and derail things here. We see others like Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, I think, taking a more measured stance on that and going ahead and voting the bill. In my quick read of it, I think this sort of doesn't really pushed the Iran nuclear deal too far off course. It's a very, very complicated set of steps. Again, whether you're in favor of it or not, it's a long, complex process. To me, this set of sanctions just tops up what we've seen in the past, and most of the senators are saying that the legislation doesn't really affect the nuclear deal with Iran one way or the other.
Very often when we hear about sanctions that the United States is pushing, whether it's on Iran or Russia, we're looking to punish these regimes, not necessarily or obviously the people who are suffering under these regimes. How can the United States essentially handle such a sticky situation in this case? So, like, for example, you have over in Russia, they are looking to sanction certain, shall we say, mining, metal, and shipping, and railway sectors. Won't that affect people on the ground, that are ordinary people? How is that going to affect the everyday person in Russia in this respect?
Well, that's a great question. And some of these sanctions since 2014 have been very, very targeted. So, they target defense companies, particular banks, energy companies. This new set ups the list and targets some of the mining, et cetera. So, I think one hopes that the ordinary Russian isn't so affected by this. Clearly, that's not what we're trying to do. And I think that's even the case a little bit with Iran. We don't want to see, an impact on the people themselves, but on the government. And these sanctions are very calibrated to shut down some of the financial instruments, particularly with Iran, but also with Russia. And, Carrie, I've got to tell you something really interesting that's not in this sanctions deal. And, in fact, the Senate voted a provision specifically to exempt something really important that we import from Russia, and that is the RD-180 engine. It's a rocket engine that fits in the Atlas V rocket, and we use it to launch satellites and launch payloads up to the International Space Station. So it is the only engine like it in the world. We have some of our American companies working really hard to replace this engine, but at the moment, and this happened under the Obama administration, the RD-180 is it for the space launch in this category. And so the Senate had to be really careful not to get the RD-180 caught up in this set of sanctions. Fascinating. So there's a lot of ins and outs. We see the same thing with Europe. The Europeans are a little worried because they do import a lot of natural gas from Russia, and their sanctions carefully walk around the need to continue that energy import relationship. So, sanctions are always a kind of a blunt tool in some ways, but these sanctions are certainly trying to put the screws on the people that are going to be most affected, the big defense companies, the big industrials, and Putin's cronies. That's who they're really going after with this set of sanctions.
Now, what about consequences for cyber activity on both ends here? What could they be facing if that happens?
Oh, so interesting. When we only ever get half the story on the cyber, right? So great idea. We're in favor of it. If we see cyber activity, there will be consequences. But even our ability to track and detect it is often so carefully guarded that when we look at this, what we see in the sanctions is, yes, if we see cyber intrusion, there will be consequences. That could take the form of increased sanctions, extra companies or individuals falling under the sanctions regime, and again, the financial controls that I talked about before. But I don't think we'll ever get more than about a quarter of the story on the cyber piece, just because our folks don't like to reveal how they track and detect all that. But the overall message is, hey, knock off the cyber attacks. And we saw that actually with China a few years ago, and it's been somewhat successful. So maybe we'll have some success here with Russia trying to get them to step back from the cyber attacks. But I wouldn't go delete your virus protection right away. It could be a long, long time before we see any progress there.
I think I heard you touch upon the whole idea of the banks, whether Russian or Iranian. How are we handling the whole idea of in particular, say, Iranian banks and the funding of, shall we say, missile activity or specific activity that would not be, shall we say, or actually would be beneficial towards their arms, towards their missile activity that we would obviously not want to see go forward?
Right. Well, it's super complicated, but the Treasury Department is really good at this sort of thing. So Iran, for example, has been banned from some of the international money clearinghouses like SWIFT for quite some time. So what we're able to do in the case of either Iran or Russia is to close off certain activities where they can convert whatever they're selling into other types of currency, and that can go after either all of Iran or it can go after specific companies. And then these sanctions also look at specific individuals. We're not getting names here, but we see some evidence that these sanctions are able to go after, if someone is very close to Putin and he's a big money holder, and then the same thing with Iran. So it's a very effective tool, and I think, the Treasury Department is really good at this. They don't like to talk about it too much, but they are very good at using this type of financial sanction, and it just makes it really hard to do business in a global economy. Hard for Iran to export its oil, hard for Russia to get what they want from their energy exports, et cetera. So the financial tool is a very effective piece of these sanctions.
Dr. Rebecca Grant, where can people find your work, and where can people find you on social?
Hey, visit me on Twitter at Rebecca Grant DC.
All right, wonderful. And also, as far as you're concerned, is there a website that people can find you on?
Absolutely, irisresearch.com. And I also write for Air Force Magazine regularly. Check that out. at afa.org.
Okay, wonderful. Rebecca, thank you so much for calling in on Patriot Tonight. We really do appreciate it.